The protagonist tells that as a child he used to get scared easily, so he was the perfect target for his cousin's mockery. And we see that they tell him that he has an old lady hanging on his back. This scares him, and he asks them to stop lying to him because there's nothing there, but they insist that it is. Until one day they cross the line and locked him in a closet, telling him that he is too afraid and needs to learn to overcome his fears. But the protagonist thinks it's their fault because they have always teased him, and he yells at them to let him out. But they leave laughing and tell him they will let him out in an hour. This terrifies the protagonist because all sorts of spirits from his imagination tormented him while he was in there. He prayed to all kinds of deities and powerful people to help him. But what saved him from the panic wasn't any of them. He remembered that he watched the movie Titanic with his best friend, Hyunjae, and in it, he saw Leonardo DiCaprio, who seemed so handsome to the protagonist that it made him blush. And that's why it was Leonardo DiCaprio who appeared in the closet, telling him that everything was fine. And he just had to hold on until the door opened, so he would accompany him the whole time. And the protagonist hugged him tightly, saying that if he could be with him, it didn't matter if it was 2 or 3 hours. And he tells that in the end, his cousins forgot that they had locked him up, so he stayed there for 4 hours until he was rescued. And the only reason he could stay calm all that time was his imaginary Leonardo DiCaprio who accompanied him. Then we see the protagonist in the present, hugging someone asleep and saying that DiCaprio's chest is very warm. When the person apologizes, it wakes up the protagonist, and the boy he is hugging asks about DiCaprio. This scares the protagonist, who asks what they are doing, and the boy says that it was the protagonist who got into bed with him. So he separates and asks if he only left him. The boy says that hugging him felt nice and warm, and he thought it felt the same way while looking at him seductively. This makes the protagonist blush, and he embarrassedly yells that he is uglier than DiCaprio. We see that the protagonist goes to the cinema because he says he is a writer of horror novels. He feels embarrassed because he didn't know there was someone else in the theater. Then we see the protagonist walking down the street while thinking about how to solve his next chapter. He looks up and sees that the street is deserted, and he thinks that if something were to come out of that pile of garbage, it would be terrifying, so he won't turn around. But then he hears a rustling behind him. He calms himself down, thinking that it must be just a person, and he looks back to check. He sees a boy watching a monster eating from the garbage, and suddenly the monster disappears. The protagonist is astonished to have seen the ghost, and the boy asks him if he also saw it. The protagonist says yes, and the boy curses because it's the first time someone other than him has seen it. Then the boy faints, saying that he let his guard down. This leaves the protagonist speechless, who then asks the boy what he meant by what he said and if he really left him alone with that pile of garbage. Here, the protagonist tells that he chose horror among all genres because his active imagination made him think he could encounter a ghost at any moment, making it more entertaining and creative. He endured 27 years convinced that ghosts didn't exist until that night. He was so scared that he ran away from his house as soon as the sun rose. He couldn't sleep, and he even washed his face with his eyes open so that no one would appear when he closed them. Then we see him working at a cafe, and he thinks that he has been locked up for too long, so he should get a part-time job soon. He believes that everything that happened at night could have been a dream because the boy was too handsome to be real. He intends to use those hallucinations in his chapter when someone calls him. We see that it's the boy, who recognizes him and says that he was the one who saw the ghost with him, which shocks the protagonist. The boy says he wanted to thank him for calling the ambulance, but the hospital didn't have his contact information. He is about to thank him when the protagonist starts touching his chest and says that it's not a hallucination. Now it's the boy's turn to faint. However, the boy tells him that he can't faint because he needs to thank him. The protagonist tries to free himself, but the boy doesn't let go until he shouts at him to do it. Then the protagonist notices the boy's features and asks if he is a vampire. Both sit down to talk, and the boy says he couldn't stop thinking about the protagonist because he is the first one who saw a ghost with him. They used to come out at fixed times, but the one from that night appeared out of nowhere, and he begins to describe it. But the protagonist asks him to stop because he is making him imagine it again, which confirms to the boy that they saw the same thing. The protagonist asks him what it has to do with him, but the boy asks him for his name. So, the protagonist gives up and tells him his name, and the boy introduces himself as Youngmin. The protagonist asks if he can go to the bathroom because it's too much to take in. There, he thinks that Youngmin is crazy, so he decides to escape. But when he returns to the table, he sees that the boy is reading his novel and asks him what he's doing. Youngmin turns excitedly and asks if he reads that novel. The protagonist replies yes, and Youngmin approaches saying that their encounter is not a coincidence. But the protagonist pushes him away and asks him what he means. Youngmin tells him that he also reads that novel, so the protagonist asks if he is a fan. But the boy says it's the protagonist who seems to be the fan, and he says that it is a masterpiece and a gem, to which Youngmin doubts. The protagonist tells him that despite what they saw, he doesn't want to get involved with him or anything similar. The only exception is the novel, so he runs away while telling him not to follow him. But Youngmin wonders if the protagonist is stupid because he forgot his cell phone. Back at the apartment, Hyunjae arrives and scolds the protagonist for not answering his cell phone and watching a horror movie alone. When the protagonist tells him he is the one who forgot his cell phone, he uses his friend's phone to call his own. But when they answer, he realizes it's Youngmin who has it. The protagonist thanks him for taking care of it and asks where he can pick it up. When Youngmin tells him that he started seeing the ghosts when he started reading the novel, and they appeared in his house exactly as described in it, the protagonist is astonished and asks if he is hallucinating. But the boy tells him that his psychiatrist confirmed that he isn't. We see Youngmin in a consultation with the psychiatrist, who tells him that there's nothing wrong with his brain but will continue giving him medication. The protagonist arrives outside the clinic, where Youngmin returns his phone. He thanks him and wishes him luck with his treatment before leaving. Youngmin asks if he doesn't want to talk about it anymore, to which the protagonist responds no. But later, the protagonist arrives at his building and asks Youngmin how long he plans to follow him. Youngmin reveals that he has been living there for 6 years. The protagonist tells him that he has been living there for 6 months in apartment 1407, while Youngmin is in 1307. The protagonist watches TV while remembering that the boy told him he must be excited about the chapter that will be released the next day. So he thinks that Youngmin must be a fan, even if he doesn't admit it, and that he went home without causing much fuss. Hyunjae comes out and they both are surprised to see each other because the protagonist is always asleep at that time. They both eat the leftover soup from the previous day, and Hyunjae asks if something happened since the protagonist locked himself in his room as soon as he got his phone back, and told him not to open the door for anyone. The protagonist insists that he saw a ghost, but his friend tells him it's just a hallucination because he doesn't eat or sleep well. But the protagonist tells him he wasn't the only one who saw it, but also a fan of his novel who seems to not know that he is the author, and who also lives in their building. But Hyunjae says he should go to the hospital because he really doesn't look good. Before leaving, the boy makes the protagonist say a prayer to a cross and suggests that since he met someone insane, he should take the opportunity to start going to church. But the protagonist responds that then he would have to start believing in demons too, so he asks for his holy water instead. The protagonist finishes working on his chapter for the day when he sees that a user has commented again. The user says that they feel sorry for the protagonist because they saw the ghost staring at him. So the protagonist says that the user is a great person who appreciates a good work since they leave a comment in each chapter. He wonders when they started commenting, so he checks the comments on his chapters until he reaches what seems to be the first one. It says that his writing is terrible, so he checks his email and sees that the user asked him where he lives and has the number 1307 in their name, just like Youngmin's apartment. So he goes and stands in front of Youngmin's door. The protagonist checks the time and is about to leave because it could be very late, but he stays because the lights are on and rings the doorbell several times. But he thinks Youngmin is not home because there's no response. Suddenly, Youngmin opens the door and comes face to face with the protagonist. The boy seems sleepy, so the protagonist wonders if he was sleeping and tells him he will come back tomorrow because it's already late. But Youngmin says it's fine and invites him in. Inside, the protagonist notices marble tiles on the floor and everything looks so shiny that it feels completely different from his own apartment. Youngmin asks if something is wrong, and the protagonist simply says that his apartment is great, which excites the boy. He asks if the protagonist wants a tour, but the protagonist says it's not necessary. The protagonist asks if Youngmin sleeps early, but the boy tells him that he actually just woke up because he sleeps all day. He can do that since he works from home, but lately, he hasn't been sleeping well due to the things he sees. He says it's already 8 o'clock, so the latest chapter of the novel must have been released. The protagonist wonders what that has to do with the chapter and looks around nervously. Youngmin asks if he visited because he decided to believe him, but the protagonist tells him it's because he saw some comments in the novel that he thinks are his. He wants to know if it's true. Youngmin asks why he believes that, but the protagonist knows he can't reveal that he is the author, so he just says they seemed like his, and Youngmin admits it's true and knows that he was curious because he is a fan. He asks if the protagonist believes in ghosts, to which the protagonist firmly says no, and Youngmin feels the same way. That's why he sees a psychiatrist, but they didn't find anything wrong with him, which is strange. And he says the protagonist is also strange for having seen the ghost. Suddenly, a loud bang is heard in the apartment, and the protagonist wonders if it came from the floor above, which is his home, but Hyunjae is not there. Then he sees enormous feet through the window, so he clings to Youngmin in terror and asks what that is. Youngmin reminds him of chapter 86 of the novel, and the protagonist sees himself describing the ghost, a foot so big that it was impossible for it to be human. The protagonist asks Youngmin if he can't do anything about it, but Youngmin says no. He asks the protagonist to close the curtains because he is too scared to do it himself. But the protagonist tells him he's crazy when suddenly the ghost peeks its face and smiles at them in a macabre way. This makes both of them scream in terror. After a while, the protagonist asks if the ghost is gone, and after Youngmin confirms that it is, they finally separate. Youngmin points out that he is sweating a lot. Later, Youngmin explains that every time a chapter is published, the ghosts from the previous one appear in his house at any time until morning. This scares the protagonist, who asks for some kind of talisman, but Youngmin says they don't work. He confirms that the protagonist also sees them. The protagonist says it has never happened to him before, and it must be because he is with Youngmin. But Youngmin tells him that even when he has been with other people, the protagonist is the only one who could see them. So the protagonist thinks it might be the apartment, but Youngmin tells him not to speak ill of it because it happens to him anywhere. He says that the protagonist is different, and maybe he won't see them if he leaves the apartment. But the protagonist doesn't want to leave because a ghost from the main door appears in the chapter. Morning comes, and Hyunjae returns to the apartment, where he finds the protagonist with a cast on his leg and surrounded by crosses. He asks what happened, and the protagonist tells him, and we see his memories. There, we see him and Youngmin huddled together, and Youngmin tells him that it happens to him every day. And that day is relatively calm. When the protagonist sees that it's already dawn outside, he rushes to leave. But Youngmin tells him to wait, and as soon as the protagonist opens the door, he encounters another ghost, which frightens him and causes him to hurt his foot. Youngmin tells him it's not yet 6 a.m. The protagonist sits on the floor crying, and Youngmin asks if he's okay while informing him that it was the last ghost. The protagonist tells Hyunjae that he saw a ghost again, so his friend asks if he has been to therapy. The protagonist tells him it's serious and cries while asking what he should do because he tried so hard to believe that they weren't real. Back at the clinic, Youngmin tells his psychiatrist about the protagonist, who sees the same things as him and saw everything with him at his house the previous night. But the doctor thinks that the protagonist may also be a ghost, so he needs to see it for himself. Youngmin tells him that he is the neighbor who lives above him and coincidentally reads the same novel, lives in the same building, and sees the same ghosts. So the psychiatrist thinks that the protagonist may be the author, but Youngmin says no because he spoke too highly of his work, so he couldn't be so brazen. He thinks that maybe the protagonist is the user who defended the novel in the comments. We return to the protagonist, who tells the same story to Hyunjae, and he asks if he knows the neighbor downstairs. And he tells the protagonist that he complained a couple of times to the building management, saying that they were making too much noise. But he ignored it because he was sure they weren't to blame. Until one day, he went to see him while the protagonist was asleep. There we see Hyunjae encountering Youngmin, who complains about the noise from the previous night. But Hyunjae tells him that they didn't make any noise because he's hardly ever home, and the protagonist works at his desk, so there can't be anyone running around as he claims, and he tells Youngmin to move if he can't stand it. Then Youngmin asks if there was a woman there at night, but Hyunjae tells him that he doesn't have a girlfriend. The protagonist interrupts and says it's a lie because he has been dating a girl for years. But Hyunjae explains that it happened when they were fighting, and that made him angrier than usual. After that, he didn't hear anything from Youngmin. The protagonist then calculates that it must have happened 2 months ago and cuddles up in his blanket, saying that it must have been when the boy started reading his novel. So Hyunjae invites him for a beer. The protagonist wonders if he should stop writing, but he says it was hard work to write the novel. Hyunjae tells him that there's no reason to stop because even if he feels like it's his fault, he can't guarantee that Youngmin will stop seeing ghosts as soon as he does. In the end, they have nothing to do with him. But the protagonist asks what if he infects him because Youngmin has been seeing those things every day. However, Hyunjae reminds him of all the effort he has put into it and everything he has achieved with his novel, even to the point of being fired from his job, so this is all he has. The protagonist agrees and says he's right because he put everything into it. Then Hyunjae tells him that he will stop seeing ghosts if he stays away from Youngmin and says that he will sleep with him that night so that he can upload the next chapter without fear. This moves the protagonist, and he wants to hug his friend, but Hyunjae tells him not to touch him, and the protagonist reminds him that his ideal type is only Leonardo DiCaprio. The next day, Hyunjae is about to leave, and the protagonist wakes up realizing that nothing happened. So he goes to visit Youngmin, who finds him in front of his door and asks him what he's doing there, dressed in a suit and holding a bouquet of flowers. So the protagonist thinks that it must have come from an important place, and he gets frustrated because even a crazy person like him has a lover. But Youngmin explains that he went to visit him at his apartment, but he wasn't there, and now he found him there. So he gives him the flowers and says they're for him. The protagonist says that it's more normal to give fruits or drinks, but the boy tells him that he bought them because they reminded him of him, and they suit him well, just as he thought. This blushes the protagonist, who wonders if Youngmin is flirting with him and wants to ask him if he likes men. Then the boy invites him to come in and eat, and the protagonist accepts. Youngmin serves him a whole feast that he personally prepared, which surprises the protagonist because he's used to ordering takeout and eating fast food. And when he tastes the food, he says it's so delicious that it could be made by a chef. Although Youngmin says he's not that good because every time he tries to cook clam chowder, he fails, which surprises the protagonist because he also likes it. And Youngmin says it's very strange that he can't make it, to which the protagonist responds that it's not like that because there are always things that one is not good at. So Youngmin tells him that he's surprisingly kind and that now he's motivated to master the art of cooking clam chowder. Youngmin washes the dishes when they finish eating, and the protagonist watches him, thinking that his jaw looks a bit like DiCaprio's. But he hits himself to control himself and asks Youngmin if the ghosts also appeared that morning, to which he responds yes, and since it didn't happen to the protagonist, he concludes that he only sees them when he's close to him. His clock shows 7:10, so the boy says they still have time to talk, and he asks the protagonist why he came to see him because it's strange after the way he ran away the previous time, especially because he came alone and with his injured leg. And the protagonist screams in his mind that it's because he feels that Youngmin is the reason he's seeing the ghosts. But for now, he just asks Youngmin for his phone number. The protagonist calls Youngmin to confirm that it's his number but realizes that Youngmin already had the protagonist's number saved. And Youngmin tells him that he saved it when the protagonist forgot his phone and that he should be more careful because his password was 4444. Just like the title of his novel, and anyone could steal it. This makes the protagonist think that he's a shameless psychopath. But then Youngmin offers him a dessert, which also amazes the protagonist with its flavor. While eating, the protagonist mentions his suspicions about the house again. But Youngmin reminds him that the ghosts appear at the same time no matter where he is, except on weekends when the novel is on pause. The protagonist asks if it also happened in places like saunas or billiard halls, and if no one else saw them there too. To which Youngmin says yes, no one else saw them, and he even brought his cousin to spend the night, but he called him crazy. And for months, he tried every method he could think of to get out of that situation, but none of them worked. Then Youngmin gets very close to the protagonist, which makes him nervous, but he just tells him that he has a dirty chin. Youngmin tells the protagonist that in the end, he gave up and got used to waiting every day for the novel to finish, until the night he met the protagonist, where he says there was a glitch in the pattern. It was a weekend, and the ghost wasn't even from the novel, and Youngmin agrees that for the first time, the rule was broken. He let his guard down, he passed out, but the protagonist was there and saw it too. So the protagonist asks if he is the variable, and Youngmin tells him that he is the first hope he has discovered. This leaves the protagonist blushing and he remembers Hyunjae's words about how the novel is all he has, while noticing that Youngmin looks miserable. So he wonders what he should do because he can't cancel the novel, but he also can't leave Youngmin alone. And he desperately wonders how he ended up in this situation. Then Youngmin asks him if by any chance he knows anything about it, like the author's contact number. This causes the protagonist to panic and tell him that he doesn't know, so Youngmin thinks it must be a mystery even for eager fans. This makes the protagonist even more anxious and uncomfortable, so he asks Youngmin what he would do if he happened to know the author. Youngmin tells him that he has had something in mind for a while, but his expression turns sinister as he says he will keep it a secret. This terrifies the protagonist, who, as he walks away, asks if Youngmin is going to kill him. This confuses Youngmin, who asks him what the hell he's thinking and if he actually knows the author. The protagonist replies that no, it was just a guess because he really doesn't know. Suddenly, it's 8 o'clock, and the protagonist receives a notification of a novel update. So he tells Youngmin that he'd better go home, while thinking that if he doesn't leave quickly, he'll see a ghost again. The protagonist returns to his apartment, where he encounters Hyunjae, and Hyunjae asks him where he was at that hour. The protagonist simply replies that he's right in front of him. His friend asks about the flowers, but the protagonist only says that someone gave them to him without specifying who and that he already ate. He then remembers when he was about to leave Youngmin's apartment, where Youngmin asked if he could come to see him because he has something to tell him. The protagonist said he could do it at any time while recalling how terrified Youngmin was. He thinks it's impossible for him to get used to it and get rid of the fear, so he informs Hyunjae that he'll spend the night outside and sleep at a friend's house, so he doesn't have to look for him. His friend tries to complain, but the protagonist leaves before he can do so. Hyunjae says the protagonist has no friends, so he wonders if it's about a girlfriend. The protagonist remembers that he survived in the closet because he thought DiCaprio was beside him, and he is not the only hope for Youngmin. So he goes back to Youngmin's apartment and tells him that he's just curious to know what he was going to say and if he can hear it now. The protagonist enters without asking, and Youngmin puts a hand on his back, making him hurry while apologizing for his foot and telling him not to look back. We see that there is a huge ghost eye watching them. Both of them are sweating and terrified. The protagonist asks why now, and Youngmin tells him that they made eye contact. They remain still but in a panic. Youngmin tells the protagonist that it will disappear soon, so they can slowly move towards the couch. But the protagonist apologizes and tremblingly asks the boy if he can hold his hand until they get there because he thinks he's going to pee himself. Youngmin sees that he is truly terrified, so he takes the protagonist's hand and says he's glad to hear that. Both of them reach the couch holding hands, but they start feeling uncomfortable and let go. The protagonist realizes that Youngmin removed the bandage from his hand. He asks Youngmin why he said that he had come back while he was in a bad mood. But the protagonist asks why he says that, as he was also so scared that he couldn't even change his clothes. Youngmin admits it's true because there's something in the closet. So the protagonist asks him what he wanted to tell him, and Youngmin responds that he thought of asking him a favor, but he was going to try it once the protagonist's leg was healed. Then he tells him what the favor is, although we don't hear it, and the protagonist seems about to do something, which Youngmin tells him he can do it next time if he's having a hard time. But trembling, the protagonist tells him no, and he will try to do it, and we see him in front of the closet door. Youngmin says he knows it's scary, but the sound it makes is a bit unusual, and the protagonist complains about him bothering him when he's taking on a difficult challenge at the moment. The protagonist grips the handle while saying that if he opens it, it will surely be there, and Youngmin says he doesn't know. So the protagonist finally opens the door with Youngmin hiding behind him, and at the back of the closet, he sees a ghost with a cut face sucking its finger. So he jumps towards Youngmin, shouting that it's there. The boy asks if he can do it, and the protagonist asks what he should say. Youngmin tells him anything that can make it disappear, so the protagonist starts shouting a bunch of different words at the ghost to make it go away. Even the Patronus charm from Harry Potter. Later on, they both return to the living room, where Youngmin serves a hot drink to the exhausted protagonist, who says it didn't work, and Youngmin replies that it would have been better to use Avada Kedavra, but he tells him that the night is still long, so they will have many opportunities to try different methods, because chapter 88 is quite intense. Morning arrives, and we see Youngmin massaging the tired protagonist, who says that pleading, swearing, and shouting together didn't work. So Youngmin says he asked too much of him, and the protagonist apologizes for not being able to be of help. The boy asks if he doesn't want to go to bed because he looks very tired, but the protagonist says no, as it's past 6 o'clock, so he gets up and says he will go after washing his face, while thinking that he was shamelessly lying on someone else's lap. The protagonist splashes water on his face, thinking that the ghost should listen to him because he's the writer. Then he opens his eyes and thinks it would be ridiculous if he looked up and saw a ghost in front of him. Suddenly, he gets goosebumps, and a bunch of hair appears in front of him. He screams that they can't be hallucinations when suddenly Youngmin's hand covers his eyes and tells him not to look. Terrified, the protagonist asks the boy if he can see it, and he says yes, even though it's past 6, and it's a ghost that's not even in the novel. Youngmin tells the protagonist that he can hug him if he's scared, so he does, and asks the ghosts to please disappear. The protagonist calms down, and after a few moments, Youngmin realizes that the ghost disappeared. This surprises both of them. Back in his apartment, the protagonist works on his chapter, which he says he needs to review and edit because it's too much and he can't just throw it away like that. Then his phone rings, and he sees that it's a message from Hyunjae, who asks if he's home because he'll be late since he has a date to go drinking. but the protagonist says he won't be there because he'll be sleeping outside again that night. So Hyunjae calls him and asks why he's sleeping outside because it's strange. And after thinking for a moment, he asks if he's going to Youngmin's house, but the protagonist tells him he doesn't know and hangs up. It's strange even for him, who is always trapped in the corner of his house, and he wonders what he should tell Hyunjae. Back in Youngmin's apartment, they both say that "please disappear" was the keyword from the previous day. However, it was an exceptional situation, not a ghost from the novel. So Youngmin says they will have to put it to the test, and he asks the protagonist if it's okay for him to help him like that all the time, because he's grateful but doesn't know the reason why he helps him so much. And the protagonist thinks that Youngmin is afraid that the ghosts will keep coming, so he's about to reveal that he is the author, but in the end, he only says that it's because he is very kind, a shy and fearful person. But it hurts him a lot to see Youngmin struggle with his favorite novel, and in those situations, it's better to help those who need it, and he can't just ignore it. Youngmin says that's correct and then reminds him of when he dressed up in a suit and gave him flowers. And he tells him that usually, everyone does him a favor when he does that regardless of gender, so he thought that the protagonist liked him. The protagonist, scared, asks if he thinks he likes men, and Youngmin says not just any man, but him, and the protagonist wonders what the hell that pervert is saying. So he's about to tell him what he thinks of him, while Youngmin waits for the response with a bright expression, until the protagonist tells him that he's not that handsome, and he thinks at least not compared to DiCaprio, and Youngmin admits that he made a mistake thinking about that. Then the boy tells the protagonist that his psychiatrist wants to see him tomorrow to check the symptoms of both individuals involved in the situation, and he tells him that he doesn't care, although he thinks the psychiatrist will treat him like a crazy person. Youngmin gives the protagonist mango for dessert, and then he says he rested and had a delicious dinner, so he feels that his quality of life is improving. At 8:15, we see that Hyunjae keeps messaging the protagonist asking where he is, when Youngmin reviews the new chapter and says that it feels a bit different for the first time. The protagonist asks if that's a compliment, and the boy tells him yes, but they'll have to wait and see. The protagonist asks why he thinks that, and Youngmin explains that until now it was just a list of situations, but the narrative was involved, so he doesn't know how it will go now. And he asks the protagonist if he's not going to explode because of that, but the protagonist tells him it's not like that. Later on, the protagonist sees the comments on the chapter, where Youngmin tells him to keep it up because the episode was interesting and fun, and he realizes that the overall comments were very good. Just then, someone knocks on the door, and the protagonist asks Youngmin if he has visitors, to which he says no, and since there's no ghost ringing the doorbell, they deduce that it must be a person. But maybe they should ignore it if it's an exceptional situation like the one from the previous day, until the person asks if nobody's there, which angers the protagonist. And when Youngmin asks if he knows him, the protagonist tells him it's his roommate Hyunjae, who asks the protagonist why he's at the boy's house, and he takes him away from the door so that Youngmin doesn't hear them. The protagonist takes him to the stairs, and Hyunjae asks if he's not going to continue writing the novel, to which the protagonist says no and that he'll explain tomorrow, although he questions how Hyunjae knew he was there. And his friend tells him that he heard his voice, and that he would have been very worried if the protagonist saw a ghost while he was drinking. And he asks him again why he was in that haunted house, to which the protagonist angrily responds that he can't leave Youngmin alone because his conscience bothers him. Both of them continue arguing when Youngmin's psychiatrist arrives, who turns out to be his cousin named Younghee, and he introduces himself to the protagonist, who asks if he wasn't supposed to visit them tomorrow, so Younghee asks if it's not Friday, and Hyunjae tells him it's Thursday. The four of them enter the apartment, where Youngmin reminds his cousin that it's Thursday, and he says he got confused because tomorrow is his day off. So the boy asks who Hyunjae is, and the protagonist explains that he is his roommate, who was worried because the protagonist was gone for several days, and he reminds Youngmin that he went to his house a long time ago. But Youngmin doesn't remember it, and Younghee explains that his cousin is not a person interested in others. Then the boy asks if they are friends, and Hyunjae responds yes, as they have known each other since they were children. But Youngmin asks again, so Hyunjae emphasizes that they are just that. However, the boy says that, for being just his friend, he is crossing the line, because the protagonist is already an adult, and Hyunjae is not his guardian, so interfering because he stayed out overnight is excessive. He responds that he doesn't usually do this, but since the protagonist was clearly scared, he thought it was someone who was pushing him to those extremes. Then Younghee looks at his watch and asks when the ghost will appear because it's past 8 o'clock. But Youngmin says that the protagonist went willingly, and Hyunjae realizes that the boy has been mispronouncing the protagonist's name. So Younghee apologizes on behalf of his cousin, who says he has bad hearing, and he asks the protagonist if he knew, to which he responds yes, but with the other variant, it sounded friendlier. Hyunjae asks the protagonist if he will spend the night there despite that atmosphere, and he says yes, because just yesterday they found a clue, so he doesn't want to miss out on the experimentation. They continue whispering when Younghee interrupts them and asks again when the ghost will come out because it's almost 10 o'clock. But Youngmin explains that they don't even know when they will appear, so both Younghee and Hyunjae ask him for clothes to spend the night, which surprises the protagonist. Later on, we see that Younghee and Hyunjae are having a good time watching TV, and the protagonist comes out of the bathroom, who asks Youngmin if he was waiting for him, but he says no, rather he doesn't want to be caught in that gap. The protagonist understands that it's an unfamiliar atmosphere for his house because Hyunjae is kind, considerate, and makes friends easily, and he tells Youngmin that if they get to know each other more, they will get along better. When Youngmin takes him by the arm and tells him to follow him because there is something that has been worrying him, Younghee tells his cousin to go watch TV when they see the protagonist on the boy's back and ask if it's a popular pose. But the protagonist stutters, and we see that it's because they have a ghost in front of them. Hyunjae asks if it's because his leg hurts, but the protagonist says it's not. And Youngmin explains that the ghost is right in front of them at that moment. So both of them ask where it is, and the boy tells them it's right in the space between the two couples. Hyunjae looks around and extends his hand forward, asking if it's there, and he almost touches the ghost, so the protagonist shouts at him to stop. Then Youngmin tells him not to panic and to try to make it disappear just like he did yesterday. So he gathers his courage, and while the ghost turns slightly towards them, he tells it to please disappear. But the ghost doesn't, and it starts bleeding. Moments later, Younghee says they still can't see it, and Hyunjae asks if they didn't succeed today. Youngmin explains that when the ghost appears in the novel, it's always about to disappear after performing a series of actions. And the protagonist says that yesterday it didn't do anything and disappeared instantly, but that wasn't a ghost from the novel, although both of them were able to see it. And Youngmin tries to hug his cousin just like the protagonist hugs Hyunjae, but he doesn't let him. Younghee asks if they know why that exceptional situation occurred, and the protagonist says he imagined it would be very scary while washing his face, something that Hyunjae says the protagonist imagines every day. Younghee then says that he believes it's like a collective hallucination because both of them read the same novel, and they are predisposed to the ghost being able to appear at any moment. The protagonist says it never happened to him until he met Youngmin, so Younghee asks him to tell him how it was that time. Then the protagonist remembers thinking it would be scary if a ghost came out of the trash, and when he looked back, he found Youngmin next to the ghost. So the protagonist wonders if his imagination comes true when he's with the boy. Hyunjae notices the protagonist's nervousness, so he tells the psychiatrist that he is scared, and a barrage of interrogative questions is too much for him. So Younghee apologizes, as he was just curious. Youngmin then asks his cousin if he's not going home, but he says he'll stay overnight, just like Hyunjae, who says that the two of them will sleep in the living room. But then Youngmin says that his cousin and Hyunjae will sleep in the living room, while he and the protagonist will sleep in the bedroom. And he explains that this is because the rest of the ghosts appear in the main bedroom, but the two of them are not helpful. And when Hyunjae tries to have them sleep there too, Youngmin tells him it's too small for everyone. So Younghee suggests that he accompany her to the store to buy a deck of cards, and Hyunjae agrees. Later, we see that the two older ones sleep in the living room, while in the bedroom, Youngmin asks the protagonist if he's really not going to use something he prepared for him. And we see that it's a pajama set identical to Youngmin's but in a different color, and the protagonist asks him why he did that. The boy tells him it's because the floor makes a lot of noise, and because his foot looks cold. So the protagonist thanks him for the gift but asks him embarrassed why the pajama has the same design. To which Youngmin responds that after trying several options, that was the one he found softest and most comfortable. He couldn't give him something without verifying it first. The protagonist tells him that he doesn't sleep there, and Youngmin responds that it would be good if he did, and he bought that for him to feel comfortable when staying at his house. So the protagonist thanks him but says he can't use it because the other two are outside. Youngmin asks him what's wrong with that, which annoys the protagonist, who thinks they clearly look like couple pajamas. Then the boy tells the protagonist not to worry because there are no ghosts in the novel today, and he sets out to work a little because when he was alone, he got so nervous that he couldn't concentrate on it. But now that he's there, he can do it. Time passes, and we see the protagonist having fun watching YouTube videos when he realizes it's 3 in the morning. And Youngmin is not in the room, so he wonders where he went. And he starts to see the room is too big, which makes him nervous and makes him shout for Youngmin, who appears and tells him he was in the bathroom. The protagonist reproaches him for not answering earlier when the boy sees a dark mist in the room. The protagonist asks him if a ghost appeared, and Youngmin tells him yes. So the protagonist wonders fearfully if it will work this time. So Youngmin approaches and tells him that the protagonist has the answer, but that he gives up. Youngmin tells the protagonist that he looks scared, so he falls onto him and tells him that he doesn't have to try anymore, because now they are together, which makes the situation much better than before, and he covers him with the blankets. The protagonist knows that Youngmin is still scared, but the boy tells him that he can handle it more than he can. The protagonist tells him that tomorrow only one ghost will appear, so they will only do it today, and he apologizes to Youngmin, who tells him it's okay. But since the ghost is there, he asks the protagonist if he can hold his hand, to which he agrees and takes it out from under the covers. Youngmin then tightly holds his hand, and the protagonist asks him if he's okay while his heart races. But the boy doesn't respond until suddenly he lifts the sheets and positions himself over him. Surprised, he tells the protagonist that the ghost disappeared again, so he asks the protagonist if he knows what they have in common between yesterday and today. Morning comes, and Young-hee scolds her cousin for not letting her know when the ghost appeared, but he tells her that it was actually him who didn't respond when she called him. The group goes out to have breakfast at the cafe, but Youngmin doesn't join them because he says he's sleepy and kicks them out of his house. So Hyunjee asks if he's normally so rude, and Young-hee tells him that despite that, people like him. And the protagonist thinks that, although he seems cold, he's actually kind. The group starts having breakfast, and Young-hee asks the protagonist what happened last night, and he says he's confused. Hyunjee tells him not to worry and asks him why he is, to which the protagonist responds that he succeeded once, but failed the second time. Young-hee asks what was different between the two, but the protagonist doesn't know because he doesn't clearly see what the disappearing instances have in common. So Young-hee summarizes the situation so far, which is that Youngmin has been seeing the ghosts for 2 months, which caused him so many problems that he couldn't go to work. And he was the only one who saw them until he found the protagonist, the only one who shares the phenomenon. So Youngmin approached the protagonist to test if he could make him stop seeing them. And the protagonist was willing to help him and share the situation, but he doesn't see them unless he's with Youngmin, and the ghosts terrify him. So he asks what the reason is for doing it besides mere compassion. And Young-hee says that Youngmin still doesn't know that the protagonist is the writer. The protagonist asks what she just said, and Young-hee tells him that instead of everything he does, there must be an infallible way to make them disappear. And she asks if he shouldn't stop writing the novel since he doesn't get paid for it, so abandoning it won't affect his life. But Hyunjee tells her that it's not a good idea for someone who knows nothing to comment on someone else's work. Young-hee agrees that she's right and tells the protagonist that it must be difficult, so he's about to admit what he feels, when the psychiatrist says that it's okay if the protagonist is not the writer. This surprises both of them, and he says that it was just a guess because he was looking for the reason why the protagonist was helping Youngmin. But the protagonist remains nervous and says that he doesn't know why he's talking about those things. Young-hee tells him that she's only saying it from an observer's point of view because she still doesn't fully believe the situation that he and Youngmin are going through. So she asks him again if he is the writer, and the protagonist and Hyunjee nervously look at each other. The protagonist then asks what would happen if he says no, and Young-hee asks if the reason he's helping his cousin is out of compassion or something more. The protagonist and Hyunjee return to their apartment, where the protagonist doesn't sleep to have time to work. Hyunjee asks if he didn't have several chapters ready, but the protagonist tells him that he went back to edit them all and forgot about the ones he had, so it turned out to be more difficult than he expected. Hyunjee tells him that he'll go back home until the next day because he'll be going out with his girlfriend, and he asks if he'll go to Youngmin's house again, to which the protagonist says yes. Then his friend warns him that Young-hee seems to be mocking him because there's no way his cousin doesn't know, so he should be careful. The protagonist finishes writing and comments that now the ghosts will only appear once every 2 or 3 episodes, to give the supporting characters more interesting relationships with the main ones. Then he remembers Youngmin's words about what they had in common when the ghost disappeared, and when he visualizes both occasions, he realizes that his heart is pounding. And he wonders if it's possible that he likes Youngmin, but he says it's not possible because he's not DiCaprio, and besides, he's a normal person, although he's not sure. And he tries to convince himself that there's no way he could like that psychopath. We see that the protagonist fell asleep while writing, and when he wakes up, he realizes it's 4 in the morning. So he remembers Youngmin, and sees that he has a missed call from him on his phone. The protagonist puts on his shoes to go out when he receives a call from Youngmin and apologizes for falling asleep and leaving his phone on silent. but Youngmin tells him it's good to hear that nothing happened to him. The protagonist asks about the ghost, but Youngmin tells him it appeared at 2 in the morning and that's it for today. This makes the protagonist feel guilty, and he tells Youngmin that he must have been scared being alone. And Youngmin replies that yes, he got used to the protagonist's presence, so dealing with it alone was more terrifying than usual. And that's why he's at his cousin's house, where he went when the protagonist didn't answer the phone. This makes the protagonist happy, and Youngmin tells him they can take it easy since there won't be any more ghosts, and it's the weekend, which saddens the protagonist a little, and he tells Youngmin that he will definitely go next Monday. Then Younghee asks his cousin why he didn't go to the protagonist's house instead of his if it's closer, because if he was scared, the protagonist would have been more helpful than him, who can't see the ghosts. And Youngmin tells him that he did go, so his cousin asks if it was then the protagonist who didn't open the door. But Youngmin tells him that it wasn't that, but rather he did go, but he changed his mind because he didn't want the protagonist to see ghosts in his house. And Younghee asks him what about his own house, and his cousin tells him that he doesn't know when they come out anyway. And besides, he doesn't even believe him. Then Younghee realizes something and asks Youngmin how many times he has been in a relationship. But Youngmin only responds by asking why he wants to know that, so Younghee tells him it doesn't matter and that he's an open-minded person. Then we see the protagonist at his house, thinking that it's better if he doesn't go if the ghosts don't appear when the novel takes a break, so he should work hard during the weekend. The protagonist closes his computer and says he can't write anymore because since he changed his plan, it has become more difficult for him to come up with ideas. He looks out the window and realizes it's getting dark, so he thinks it's time to go downstairs. But he blushes and thinks he doesn't have to go today. Some time later, we see that he ordered food delivery, but when he tries it, he's disappointed because it tastes bad. At that moment, Hyunjae returns and asks the protagonist what he's doing and why he's at home. He explains that since it's the weekend, he doesn't have to visit Youngmin, and his friend understands that it's because he's taking a break from the novel. The protagonist asks if he has already eaten, and Hyunjae says he had dinner with his girlfriend, so he asks why the protagonist doesn't eat what he just ordered. And the protagonist responds that it's because every night he had been eating homemade food, so the delivery food doesn't taste good now. Hyunjae understands that it's because the protagonist has been eating at Youngmin's house every day, and wonders why he looks so healthy for someone who sees ghosts. Then he asks if Youngmin is also good at making clam soup, but the protagonist tells him no, so Hyunjae feels relieved, because if the protagonist likes a heterosexual person, he can guarantee that he will end up suffering. Then the protagonist tells him that he has something to ask, which is if his heart races when he's with a pretty girl. Hyunjae tells him that his girlfriend is the only one for him, but the protagonist asks him to assume that he doesn't have a girlfriend, someone who is even kinder and prettier than a celebrity, although not as much as Angelina Jolie. Hyunjae wonders why he has to be less than her, but he says that with someone so beautiful, it would be difficult not to react, so his heart could beat faster. So the protagonist asks if that's natural and doesn't necessarily mean that he's in love with them. But Hyunjae says it could be the first step for him to like someone. And suddenly he asks if his questions are because his heart races for Youngmin, to which the protagonist shouts back that it's not true, and they blame each other for shouting. Then we see the protagonist in his bed, thinking that his heart did race, and he realizes that his creepy creations disappear every time Youngmin makes his heart race. Then he closes his eyes and wonders what Youngmin is doing now and if he went out. But then he gets up and says he has to stop thinking about him, so he tries to focus on other thoughts. At that moment, the ghosts come to his mind, and he looks towards the cabinet, thinking that there might be one there. So he gets chills and wonders if it will appear if he imagines it even when he's alone. And that's how the first part of this manhwa ends. If you've reached this part of the video, let me tell you that you've been one of the few people to make it here, so comment the word love in the comments. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss any videos. With that said, see you in the next video.